He left the contract on the marble table like a verdict, his shoes whispering across the hallway as if the apartment itself wanted to forget him. "Sign, and you leave," Gianni Ferraro had said without looking back, as if exile could be codified in ink. His voice was the sound of ice breaking. Lucia watched the sleeve of his suit disappear past the floor-to-ceiling window, and then the city, as if the whole skyline were an accomplice. The paper trembled under her hand, more from the knowledge of what it meant than from the chill in the room. A settlement, a silence clause, and the final phrase, he could not build an heir with her, and therefore she was dispensable. That single sentence, precise and brutal, stripped her of wifehood, of the public life they'd cultivated, and of the myth she had believed she lived inside, that professional worth and private tenderness could coexist without either being sacrificed to the other. Her name, once spoken in conference rooms with deference and sharp nods, now traveled on the lips of men who smirked and of women who lowered their eyes. In the mirror, she saw not the litigator who had drafted clauses to protect the vulnerable, but the hollowed outline of someone measured and found insufficient by the most intimate of metrics. Wait before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. She left the penthouse with a suitcase and the humiliating knowledge that the world could so efficiently reclassify a person. Milan's late autumn fog welcomed her like an indifferent congregation. Lucia Moretti, formerly Ferraro, moved into a modest three-room flat in a borough that kept its shutters half closed against the wind. The building smelled of yeast and old wood. Laundry fluttered like small flags from modest balconies. For the first time in years, Lucia walked past the butcher whose boyhood she remembered and did not need to calculate how to monetize an encounter. She could not sleep. In the spaces between breath and breath, she rehearsed arguments she might have made, legal statutes she had once wielded, and the raw line Gianni left behind as if announcing a natural law. Her body had failed her marital duty. Her reputation was a bruise no lawyer could stitch. The press smelled blood and fed on the simplicity of it, sterile headline after sterile headline. CEO leaves wife over infertility. Friends disappeared in polite messages, their own lives 1,000 small calculations of risk and advantage. The firm where she had built an iron reputation murmured about conflicts of interest, as if scandal alone could fracture a career made from precision. People who once sought her counsel now refused the complication of closeness. It was a betrayal that cut along public and private lines. She had defended corporate clients from predatory claims, written memos that let men like Gianni bend rules. Now she needed the very institutions she had fortified to protect her, and they had been reshaped by the hands that had profited from her labor. In the quiet of her new kitchen, she kept the contract folded in a drawer under a stack of court files, legal instruments she could read as if they were medicine, but the humiliation stuck under her tongue like a foreign word. Across town, Marco Rossi Santoro tied rubber boots before breakfast and listened to the small, fierce symphony of his children. 5 pairs of feet, 5 complaints about toast, 5 versions of what school meant, 5 unique questions about the sky. Marco moved through this chaos with the old precision of a man who had once kept a ledger of who owed what and who had crossed whom. He had traded gunmetal for gingerbread, deadlines for parent-teacher conferences. His hands still bore the soft scars of a life he rarely discussed. The children thought the marks came from a kitchen mishap. He kept his past in the shape of small rituals, the Saturday market for fresh produce, telling them exactly when he'd be home for homework, never bringing a stranger into their worlds. The neighbors knew him as the quiet father who fixed bicycles and taught self-defense in the community center gym. They loved him for his reticence, for the way his laugh came slow and rarely, for how he was always there. Marco ran a modest security outfit, Rossi & Co., on paper. Home network installations, cameras, alarm systems, and a self-defense class 2 nights a week for women who wanted to learn how not to be easy targets. Unofficially, he took assignments that needed a hand no one wanted to mention in polite conversation: discreet surveillance, recovering blackmail materials, advising clients who were afraid of being followed. He refused anything that smelled like old vendettas, and yet the city was full of grays that pulled him in. He kept a ledger not of debts, but of promises, the ones he'd made to his children when he abandoned the old code. No secrets at the table, he'd told them, which meant he lied in the smallest, most careful ways to preserve the safety he had bought with silence. When Lucia contacted Rossi & Co., it was because envelopes began arriving at her building. Plain, unmarked, each one a negative. Photographs of the penthouse, snippets of a conversation not meant for her eyes, a doctored email that suggested infidelity, and a copy of the contract with the word defective scrawled across it in a certain blunt hand. The doorman, who had come from that borough and knew how neighborhoods kept each other's secrets, slid her the first envelope with a look that said he had never seen the scales tip so fast for someone he had once admired. "They say it wasn't personal," he told her quietly. "They say it never is." Lucia felt the words like frost. She hired Marco because the threats smelled like the Ferraro boardroom. Precise, surgical, intended to corrode reputation rather than to frighten physically. She needed cameras, she said, and someone to trace the messages. What she did not say was that the messages arrived at times when her breath caught and the quiet felt like an accusation. Their first meeting was terse, public, and strangely intimate. Marco arrived carrying a toolbox and an espresso thermos. His coat had the pitying grace of someone who had learned to be useful without being sentimental. Lucia looked at him and for a fissured moment saw not the man she had hired, but a tableau of lives she had not known existed. Evenings repairing toys, the smell of boiled cabbage, 5 sticky handprints around a kitchen table. She told him about the envelopes with a lawyer's cadence, facts arranged like small coffins. While he watched her hands, the way they folded the letter into a careful rectangle. He listened without judging. "We can install new locks," he said, voice even. "We can trace the origin of the messages. We can put cameras in places that aren't obvious. But there's a difference between being safe and being watched. Do you want the cameras to keep you safe, or to watch the men who think they can take your life apart?" She stared at him as if they were two people on different boats watching the same storm. "I want my name back," she said eventually, and the admission sounded like an animal sound at first, small, raw. "I want them to stop measuring me by what I cannot do." Marco's eyes softened with the kind of recognition that comes from living with hard choices. He understood what it meant to be assessed by absence. He had been judged by renunciations as much as by action. "Names can be reclaimed," he said, "but it isn't my name to give. I can make sure no one slips through your doors, no one slips through your screens. For the rest, you'll need more than cameras." In the weeks that followed, Rossi & Co. became a presence in the small life Lucia allowed herself. Marco's team, 3 quiet technicians and a woman named Teresa, who once served as a municipal hacker in a cleaner era, pried open the apartment's old wiring and rewired it like arteries. Cameras were tucked behind potted plants, motion sensors slid like teeth into doorframes. The city seemed to watch back. Lucia found ordinary acts restored into rituals. Making coffee without checking for bugs, answering the door without looking at a screen, standing by the window and not flinching at the sight of Giannis Tower when the afternoon hit glass like an accusation. Marco kept his distance with a professional courtesy that made her feel both protected and small. She tracked his arrival times with a private gratitude she did not understand. He, in turn, watched her with a complicated kindness. She was something he wanted to guard, a stubborn, dignified figure who had lost her public oxygen and yet refused to become a cautionary tale. There were moments when the imbalance between them pressed against fragile chords. Once, after a long day, Lucia offered him the last piece of tiramisu, a small attempt at homeliness. Marco refused with a grin that softened into apology. "I have sugar rules with the kids," he said. "I can't be the parent who breaks them." She laughed, and the sound was brittle as glass underfoot. Later, as he set up a camera in the corridor, he discovered a child's drawing glued to the inside of her cupboard by a tenant who had once lived there. An accidental sonnet that Marco recognized instantly as the work of someone who loved small things fiercely. He left the drawing in place, a quiet promise that not everything about her world needed fixing with blueprints and boxes. But the shadows kept arriving. One evening, after a rain that smelled like iron and old money, a note slipped under her door. Short, typed, anonymous. "Some things aren't meant to be reclaimed," it read. The paper had no fingerprints. Lucia's hands trembled for the first time in months. Lucia's hands trembled for the first time in months. She called Marco, and for the first time, he did not arrive with measured restraint. He arrived with a speed that belonged to old instincts. He asked questions with a bluntness that made her feel either bared or protected. "You think Ferraro is behind this?" he asked. "You think it's personal enough to become dangerous?" She wanted to say no, but the truth had the weight of evidence. Gianni commanded reputations, and reputations commanded realities. He had the kind of reach that could turn a rumor into a legal headache, a private vendetta into a public stalking. Lucia pictured the penthouse like a stage where Gianni had perfected his exits. She pictured the men who signed his checks and whispered in corridors. She pictured her own hands, useless before that contract. Behind every legal maneuver she had once made, there now stood a man whose signatures bent banks and whose grudges bent lives. If he wanted to erase her, he had the mechanisms. Marco's jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with the polite father he portrayed at parent-teacher meetings. This was a man whose muscles had learned to hold danger in reserve, to be present and unflinching when children needed bread on the table. "I'll look into the origin of the message," he said softly, "and we'll tighten things. But you need to prepare for escalation. Men like Ferraro don't stop at notes. They build narratives until people believe them." Lucia looked at him, and for the first time since the contract, felt a stir of something that was not entirely grief. An ember that wasn't yet love, but wasn't only gratitude either. She recognized in him the capacity for violence and the refusal to bring it home, and that complex refusal terrified and attracted her in equal measure. The dilemma that closed the act wasn't dramatic in a way that tabloids would understand. It was the small, poisonous negotiation of choices. Stay hidden in her flat and let her name be buried under whispers of shame, or step into public light to fight the narratives and risk the men who shaped them. Marco offered cameras and routes of escape. The city offered exposure and the chance, perhaps, of reclaiming what Gianni had taken. The crucial division lay between two fears: being unmade quietly or being shattered loudly. Lucia stood at a window that framed both options, the Ferraro Tower glinting like accusation, and the small street below humming with other people's lives. She could surrender without a fight and let her name rot in the gutter of gossip, or she could stand up and make herself a target for a man who had never been known to lose. The choice felt less like strategy than like a test of what she believed she could withstand. The note's blunt phrase sat on her kitchen table like a small corpse. She pressed her thumb to the paper until the fibers left a print, and realized with a cold clarity that this fight would be fought not only with evidence and law, but with nerves, with nights spent wide awake waiting for the other shoe. Marco moved through her apartment differently after that. No more casual pauses by the fridge, no more jokes about sugar rules. He cataloged vantage points, marked exits with the economy of someone who knew how often plans died in the details. Lucia watched him work as if she were being taught the anatomy of safety. Every camera angle he chose felt like a stitch securing a wound. Their conversations grew longer and bolder. At first, they were functional, questioning delivery timelines, tracing IP addresses, debating the utility of a dead drop versus a direct trace. But gradually, like hairline cracks widening under the weight of water, they leaned into personal confessions that neither seemed to intend. One late afternoon, while Marco calibrated a sensor in the bedroom, Lucia asked, quietly, "Did you ever imagine this? Raising 5 children in a world that always wanted something from you?" The question held no lawyer's armor, only the ache of one woman testing whether her hurt mattered in another life. Marco paused, a screwdriver balanced between fingers like a punctuation. "I imagined simpler things," he said. "Meatballs on Sundays, somebody to call about the washing machine. The old life never promised any of that." He didn't say what he had given up. Favors, names, the easy authority of a man who could make people obey. But she felt the omission as clearly as if he'd laid a hand on the table. In the evenings, he shared small domestic details. How his eldest, Sophia, read aloud to the youngest, Matteo, and how he kept a stash of library books in the trunk of his car because the municipal branch closed early. She began to imagine him in her life in minor ways, making coffee for her when she worked too late, a child's backpack left in the hall like evidence of unexpected adoption. That budding intimacy did not soften the edges of their power imbalance. Marco could discipline with a look. He could, if he chose, return to the old life and make a problem disappear in a way lawyers could not account for. Lucia knew this truth with the same steadiness she had once reserved for statutes. Physical force carried a moral currency, and depending on it could cost more than it paid. Once, after a late call from Gianna's lawyer, thinly veiled threats about the inevitability of certain reputational consequences, Lucia sat down heavily and whispered, "Do you think he would harm you to get to me?" Marco folded his hands and, for the first time, let a small, uncharacteristic tremor show in the set of his jaw. "He has the means," he said, "but he also has a reputation. He's careful. Men like him prefer to move others' hands rather than stain their own." The implication chilled her more than any promise of violence. Her enemies would use proxies, and proxies were people with mortgages and mistakes and, often, children. As the practical work of protection settled into routine, other threats arrived in more creative, corrosive forms. Smudged emails started circulating again, this time crafted to appear as confidential memos from a boutique fertility clinic that suggested experimental treatments, procedural errors, a misdiagnosis years ago. The papers were expertly forged, and the language, clinical, compassionate, and ultimately damning, reached a different audience. The small network of mothers who judged every woman's reproductive history like a litmus test for moral character. Lucia found herself receiving condolence notes she had not asked for, messages that saw her as a parable rather than a person. A parent at a school committee pretended to be cautious when she crossed paths with Lucia, and a man who had once been solicitous now failed to meet her eye. Lucia responded with the only tool she knew. She went back into the law like a pilgrim returning to a shrine, reading rulings and precedents, compiling a dossier that would make the animals of gossip uncomfortable. She met with a journalist she trusted, one who had once defended her on a complicated antitrust case, not to beg, but to prepare. "If Ferrero tries to erase me with a narrative," she told the journalist, "I'll need the truth to be louder than his money." The journalist nodded, a professional's oath in his expression. He promised to hold a line, But even he admitted that the public favored simple narratives. Nuance was a luxury rarely afforded to scandal. It was in the deep middle of these strategies that the first fracture revealed itself. Not a rupture, but a hairline split that widened because of fear. Marco, who had always presented restraint as a creed, began to make unilateral choices. He intercepted a delivery that had been meant for Lucia and, acting on suspicion, opened it before she could consent. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots of her leaving a clinic years ago, carefully time-stamped and annotated. The images were invasive, but their provenance was unclear. Marco's decision to open the package without asking hit a raw nerve. Lucia felt the old humiliation return. A man deciding on her behalf, determining the meaning of an object that implicated her life. "You don't get to do that," she said, softly, and there was hurt in the words that made him look away. He bristled, then softened. "I didn't know what else to do," he said. "I thought if I knew the angle they were working, I could stop it." The honesty in his voice did not mend the moment. Lucia realized that their trust had been an implicit transaction. She gave access because she had to. He gave protection because he could. The dynamic made the tenderness they were building feel precarious, like a vase on a precipice. She closed her eyes and thought of the contract Johnny had left on the marble table, the objectified phrase that had reordered her life, and understood with a terrible clarity that protection could be its own kind of possession. Complications multiplied when Teresa, Marco's technician with a tidy law school past, returned with bad news. She had traced the forged documents to a ghost server used by a contractor who once worked for Ferraro Enterprises. The breadcrumbs led to a cluster of shell companies and a handful of freelance propagandists, people who specialized in shaping reputations for the kind of men who never wanted to soil their own hands. "This is corporate," Teresa said bluntly, her fingers twitching over a laptop as if she could physically erase the line of code. "Not personal. This isn't an ex-lover. This is a machine." The revelation made Lucia feel both relieved and smaller. Relieved because the threat had form and therefore could be fought. Smaller because the machine was enormous and she had only one small kettle of strategies to pour onto it. Johnny, as a figure, loomed larger in the small theater of their lives. He orchestrated from a penthouse that reflected daylight like an accusation. He moved his pawns, lawyers, PR firms, a network of favored journalists, and watched the dominoes tilt. For him, public humiliation was efficient. It cleared obstacles and sent a message to other men who might be tempted to challenge his control. To Lucia, the knowledge that she would be the subject of a corporate campaign produced a peculiar isolation. The institutions she had once fortified could be turned against her. The men whose decisions she had helped render legal were now instruments in the narrative that would try to flatten her. Yet there were also tender, almost comic moments that reminded them both that life continued in the small rituals. Marco's youngest, Matteo, arrived at the flat one rainy afternoon with a soggy soccer ball and a cheerfully blunt assessment. "You have the nice plates, signora." He announced himself with the unself-conscious confidence of children who are not yet wary of whispers. Lucia, who had once been a woman measured by a single failing, found herself laughing at the boy's frankness. Marco watched her laugh, the corners of his mouth softening in a way that invited trust again. It was in these moments, children's bluntness, stolen morsels of pastry, the scent of laundry drying in a small kitchen, that Lucia began to test what safety might feel like if it included others. The ebbing and returning of their intimacy carved a new dilemma. Marco's interventions were necessary. He had discovered a pattern in the ghost servers and had identified likely operatives, but every step he took tethered him more tightly to the conflict with Ferraro. He told Lucia one evening that the men he had begun to engage were asking questions about his past. Small, probing inquiries about old allegiances. "They call, they test me," he said. One of them mentions a name from years ago, Napoli. They want to know who can be bought or scared. Lucia watched him and felt the axis of their lives tilt. If Marco engaged, he risked waking ghosts he had promised to keep asleep. If he held back, the machine Ferraro commanded would have freer reign. She thought of the choice Johnny had made: exile for her, a clean contractual tie cut with a signature, and understood how easy it had been for him to treat people as optional. The more she learned about the apparatus arrayed against her, the less she could be satisfied with surviving alone. Her legal instinct, stubborn and exacting, told her that she needed allies with messy histories and clear loyalties. "If he's testing you," she said into the phone, addressing danger as if it were a person, "then we answer. We don't bow. We expose the machine for what it is." There was steel in the sentence, a return to the litigator she had been, but also a tremor at the edges, a fear of what naming to do. That night, after Marco had left and the apartment hummed with the low life of a building that had stories old as its wood, Lucia sat with the camera feeds and listened to the small electric chorus of security systems. Each blinking light represented a choice: to retreat under invisible blankets and wait for the world to forget, or to step into the light and fight for a name that had been almost taken. For the first time since Johnny's departure, the thought of calling him, of confronting him publicly, did not seem like a child's fantasy. It felt possible. It felt dangerous. The act closed on a decision that was more moral than tactical. Lucia would no longer hide. She would not let fear dictate the shape of her days. But she would not do it alone. She reached for Marco's contact and pressed send on an invitation that carried both strategy and a fragile personal tremor. "Meet me tomorrow at the municipal library. I need allies for what comes next." She did not say she wanted him to be part of the allies, because she felt something unnamed and tender whenever he stayed longer than the installation warranted. She did not say that the prospect of being chosen, by a man with a past he had refused to bring home, felt like a new kind of inheritance. Marco read the message under the dim light of his van, children asleep in the back seats like small breathing burdens of hope. He stared at the screen and thought of the men calling him, of the names they'd mentioned, of the ledger he had swapped for pasta nights and school recitals. He felt the old code like a muscle twitching under the skin. Protecting Lucia would mean contravening the silence he had kept for his children's sake. It would mean inviting men to find them where they most wanted peace. He considered stepping back, of suggesting professional replacements, of building walls with quieter hands. Then he thought of how Lucia held the contract in the apartment drawer, and how she had once drafted the very clauses that now shielded men like Gianni. He thought of the laughter the children had given to a woman who had been declared inadequate for reasons no one could bear publicly. His reply was brief, a line that could have been transactional but wasn't. "I'll be there." The answer carried the weight of a promise, and neither of them yet understood how the promise would ask them to change. The world outside, already a telescope of money and reputation, tightened like a fist. Inside the small apartment, a camera winked a steady, indifferent light. A child somewhere practices a song she shouldn't know yet. Two adults inhaled and prepared to step into motion. The email that arrived the next morning read like a surgical incision. Subject line, a single word, evidence, and an attachment that was too large to be innocent. Lucia opened it with the same deliberate calm she used in courtrooms and felt her stomach drop as a sequence of files bloomed on the screen. There were bank transfers with coded references to clinics and shell corporates, invoices that matched the dates of the forged memos Teresa had traced, and, worst of all, a video file. She clicked it, hands steady until the first frame. Gianni in a glassed boardroom, smiling the way men smile when they have already decided the terms of someone's life. He signed a stack of papers, then absently flicked a cigarette into an ashtray, an old habit he had kept even when his PR team insisted he stop. The camera angle changed, and for a second Lucia wondered whether she was watching a confessional or an instruction manual. The video showed a man she recognized only by reputation, an intermediary in a muted suit, delivering envelopes to a clinic and then to a series of accounts. The footage was grainy, but the ledger numbers matched Teresa's finds. Someone with access and motive and patience had compiled a dossier that looked like a prosecution. She called Marco without thinking, fingers fumbling, because this was the edge they had said they would meet together. His voice came through hoarse but fast. He said he was on his way. When he arrived, he carried no tools, only the old scarred leather of a man who kept his world in his chest. The video looped while they watched in silence. Teresa arrived minutes later, breathless with the rhythm of someone who had been up half the night tracing a spike of IP addresses. "This is corporate laundering," she said plainly, and the word landed on them like a forecast of winter. "It's not only reputation management. There are payments to men who make reputations for sale. They pay the brokers who plant the stories." The revelation should have been vindication, a neat path to clearing Lucia's name. Instead, it cracked open the world in unexpected ways. For one, the video included an image of Marco, or rather of a man who looked like him in profile, given the angle and the grain. Same set of shoulders, same small habitual hitch in posture when he reached into pockets. Teresa swore she had not doctored the footage, that the metadata suggested an internal leak, someone using an old contact list to place a man in a clip that would inflame a spectator's imagination. Lucia felt the air leave the room with the speed of a legal brief slammed down in court. Even the implication of Marco's likeness in the materials meant consent in other people's minds. Reputations, once suggested, gather weight like sediment. "Who gave them that clip?" Marco asked, voice low. The words were a challenge, but they carried a hidden fear. If anyone thought he had gone back to his old life, his children would be the ones to pay for it. Already he imagined the whispers at the school gates, the quick questions to neighbors, the legal men who would show up with soft smiles and steal agendas. "I haven't been anywhere near Ferraro's people. I walked away. I changed my name, figuratively. I don't owe them anything." Yet, guilt is not always ownership. Sometimes it is the fear that others will impose their definitions on you. Marco folded his hands until his knuckles whitened. Lucia watched him and saw how his posture shifted when danger tested him, not with the theatricality tabloids wanted, but with the quieter strain of a man trying to keep a life he loved from being burned. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, the litigator in her sharpening, because she understood that a reactive defense would always be one step behind Ferraro's machinery. "We need the journalist now. We need public records, bank trails, a narrative that ties the payments to orders given." Her voice was steady, but her throat tightened as if the words themselves needed legal counsel before they could be spoken aloud. Teresa was already keyed in, fingers flying across a keyboard as if she could catch the trail in midair. "There's a pattern," she said. "Small payments, periodic, names of clinicians who don't exist, consulting fees routed through Milan, then to offshore. Whoever stitched this together knew exactly how to hide a trace and how to make a smudge look like an accident. But if you follow the money long enough, it starts to leave a shape. The shape, when revealed, had the outline of a corporate hand, and not merely a hand that had signed papers, but one that had bought a language to erase women like Lucia. They built a plan on declamatory grounds and small mechanics. Lucia would go public, but not alone. She would present the evidence she had assembled with the journalist's corroboration and Teresa's technical witness. Marco would be at her side, but not merely as bodyguard. He would testify to the fact that insinuations had been planted, that men with resources used proxies to do their laterally violent work. "We need to show the method," Lucia said. "We have to teach the public to recognize a machine." The tactic felt righteous, but it also invited retribution. The more luminous they made the machine, the more fiercely its inventor would try to guard his field. That night, as they rehearsed statements in a borrowed conference room at the community center, Teresa adjusting slides, Marco practicing a short, unadorned testimony about what he had found, the fracture within their fragile coalition widened. It came not from argument, but from fear, and histories too different to reconcile without pain. Marco, when asked whether he would testify to patterns he had traced himself, hesitated. He wasn't worried about being believed. He was worried about the collateral, the men in the shadows who would come not after him, but after the children he had sworn to protect. "I can do the cameras. I can testify to the technical stuff," he said slowly. "But the things you want me to say about networks, about allegiances, that's a kind of war. Men don't lose those wars quietly." Lucia looked at him and felt an ache that had nothing to do with the old humiliation and everything to do with the tender, brittle hope she had built in his presence. "If they can make me disappear with a narrative, with the fiction of my history, they will do the same to your kids if they think you are an instrument," she said. Her words were blunt but not cruel. They were a surgeon's cut designed to reveal the infection. Marco's face closed like a book. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped, and the sound surprised them both, sharp and defensive in a way that betrayed fear more than temperament. He left the room without his coat, the gesture a childlike departure designed to show he could not stay but might return. When Marco returned hours later, after a night of restless driving that had ended with him dropping off breakfast at school and pretending his day would be ordinary, he did not come back with renewed serenity. He came back with a new bruise around his patience, an invisible mark that changed the tenor of their relationship. He began to take actions without consulting Lucia, quietly meeting a man who dealt with disappearances in older, bloody lines, making a call to a contact who could place surveillance on the origins of the videos at physical, not digital forums. He rationalized these moves as necessary, as the maneuvers of a man trying to obviate threat rather than wait for it. But to Lucia, who had spent a life making lists and making others account for their choices, these unilateral strategies felt like the same old thing. A man deciding for a woman that he would determine what safety looked like. A new humiliation slid between them. Not sexual, not corporate, but moral. The sting of someone else assuming authority over your life. The distance consolidated into tense silences and long, compartmentalized conversations. Lucia found herself returning to the conversation she had had with Gianni, where the terms of her life had been decided in ink and signature. The difference now was that the signatures came in back rooms and on phones, and the decisions were framed as protection rather than abandonment, as care rather than dispossession. Her legal training taught her to parse motives, to weigh evidence, to distrust unilateral acts cloaked as benevolence. Marco's actions, even as he sought to shelter, began to replicate patterns of control she had sworn never to inhabit. On a wet morning, when the city seemed coated in a gray patience, a new file arrived, a custody petition, preemptive and anonymous, claiming that Marco's unofficial activities posed risks to his children's welfare. Lucia opened the packet and felt the world tilt. The petition had been drawn up by a name that traced back to one of Ferraro's legal allies. Predictable, cold, efficient. It was a trap that weaponized institutions against a man who had only tried to leave a violent life for a gentle one. The petition would force Marco into hearings, into public accounts of his past, precisely the place he feared most. When he told her, his voice broke for the first time in months. "They want my children," he whispered, and the simplicity of the sentence made her stomach lurch. The city seemed suddenly cruelly small. A room with papers, an administrative clerk, a judge who would not see the tenderness in his nightly kitchen songs. Lucia sat with him at the kitchen table and for the first time did not offer legal strategy or a checklist. She reached across the table, placed her hand on his, and let the contact be a small human affirmation. "They've made families into tools," she said. "We name them as what they are." The fracture that had been a set of distances now hardened into a stark fork. Marco, fearing the exposure of his children's lives and the bureaucratic cruelty that would follow, suggested he step away from active cooperation, temporarily, until the custody matter calmed. Lucia, furious and terrified of being left alone to face a machine, reacted with a rawness that came from a life taught to fight. "You can't barter away my voice to save your children," she said. "If we do that, the machine wins twice. Once when it ruins me, and once when it forces you back into silence." It wasn't just anger. It was a recognition that their loyalties had diverged under pressure. He left that afternoon and did not return for 2 days, a self-imposed exile to keep the children from seeing the argument. Lucia watched the camera feeds and found herself more alone than when the contract had been on the marble table. The journalist called to check if she wanted to push the story without Marco. She declined. The case, she believed, needed to be a public partnership, not because of sentiment, but because of strategy. The public needed to see a man willing to risk his children's security to protect the idea that corporations could be accountable. But she also understood the cruelty of asking that sacrifice. When Marco finally came back, weary-eyed and drained, he did not bring the docile rapprochement she had hoped for. Instead, he came with a new indignity, an ultimatum from his contact that required him to show willingness to cooperate with an older, less visible code if he wanted his children left alone. The ultimatum hung in the space like a threat that smelled of oil and rust. Lucia looked at him and saw the old man in his gestures and the new man in his refusal to return to violence. "I will not become what they want," he said. "I will not bring that into my children's lives. But I cannot stand in the open and watch them be used as weapons." They stood at the precipice where their aims collided, Lucia's need for public reparation and Marcos's need for private protection. It was a fracture not of passion, but of fundamental responsibilities, one to self, one to children. It was the kind of break that did not shout. It rearranged daily life, made beds colder, and introduced a caution into laughter. They loved, if the word could be used in such elastic form. But the love was now freighted with strategic contradictions that neither had the power to resolve alone. And while they circled these jagged edges, Johnny watched from his tower and smiled as only men with entire industries of deniability can. He had not needed to strike directly. He had only needed to open machines he had paid for and let them spool. The fracture he watched was not a victory so much as an experiment. Would two people break themselves trying to stop him? Or would the institution he represented simply fold them into its appetite and move on to the next life whose name it could erase? The answer, as yet, was unsettled. The act closed with Lucia alone, sitting on the edge of the couch, the city pressing in through the windows with a cold brilliance. She had documents and allies and a camera feed that would not sleep. She had a man who had chosen her, imperfectly, and then retreated to honor another choice he had made to his children. The fracture hummed between them like a tuned string, something that could snap or, if played carefully, might yet produce a sound of reconciling harmony. She inhaled, steadying herself against the knowledge that truth and family both demanded sacrifice, and that sometimes sacrifices required choosing which kind of loss one could survive. Marco returned to the apartment at dawn with his hair still damp from rain and a list of small, precise indignities on his mind. He had slept in the van, the children delivered to school by a neighbor who owed him a favor, And he had driven without purpose until the city blurred into a geometry of headlights and anonymous faces. When he opened the door, Lucia was there at the stove, an old kettle singing with the kind of patience she now had to practice. She did not ask where he had been. She only set a cup across from him, and the fragile ritual of breakfast became their first quiet reconciliation. "There's going to be a hearing," he said without preamble, his voice low as if the walls might carry the announcement into the wrong ears. "Preliminary. They want to interrogate patterns, allegiances. It will be ugly, Lucia." He avoided saying the word custody, but the meaning settled between them like a winter stone. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleepless nights. He looked weary of being tested again and again for sins he had tried to bury. Lucia reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the small calluses she had begun to know. "Then we make it ugly for them," she said. Her voice held the steady steel that had once cut through corporate defenses. "We will not shrink. We make them account in public. They brought paper to erase me. We bring paper back that shows the ink." She spoke with the precision of a lawyer and the heat of someone who had been stripped and was learning to clothe herself in action. He studied her for a long moment, as if measuring whether this battle would cost him the life he'd built for his children. "If you go public," he said finally, "they will target the kids. They'll use their schools, their teachers. They'll send queries and fake allegations. They won't stop at me." The fear behind his words was not rhetorical. It settled into the room like a second guest. "Then we do it together," Lucia answered. "Public, yes. But planned. No surprises. We expose the machine in a way that isolates the operators and protects the children as much as we can." Her mind already moved through legal motions, subpoenas, chain of custody, publicly filed affidavits that would make it harder for Ferraro's operators to improvise smears. She did not pretend the strategy would keep every blade away, but it could blunt the edges. They built a new coalition that day, not only between them, but among unlikely allies. The journalist agreed to embargo the story until Teresa could produce irrefutable technical corroboration. A former colleague of Lucia's, one who owed her a professional debt and a lingering conscience, offered to prepare emergency filings that would block frivolous custody claims from being weaponized without judicial oversight. Marco's old contact, an elder who had not been seen in the city for years and who still held small favors, agreed to watch the children's schools and report suspicious inquiries without fanfare. These were compromises, trade-offs that ceded nothing essential but acknowledged the vulnerability of the lives entwined in the fight. The first public move was surgical. Lucia, with Teresa's forensic dossier and bank trails in hand, convened a small press conference in a neutral space, a municipal room where light came through high windows and where the hum of bureaucracy insulated them from glossier cameras. She read a brief statement that stripped melodrama from her voice. She spoke of forged medical memos, of laundering through shell companies, of payments funneled through clinics that existed only on paper. She did not cry, she did not plead. She offered evidence and a demand. An independent inquiry into Ferraro Enterprises' reputation management contracts. Watching her from the front row, Marco aligned his breath to hers. He kept his hand in his pocket, the tactile habit of someone who knew how to hold still under pressure. When the journalist asked whether Marco Santoro, who had been named in doctored footage, had any connection to Ferraro's network, he stood and answered with a plainness that cut through insinuation. He described his life, the routines of school pickups, the tastes of 5 children's favorite breakfasts, and he testified to what he had done for Lucia. Security installations, GPS traces, a willingness to protect. He refused to dramatize his past and would not let the public narrative of it be used as a weapon against his family. His testimony was not a confession of heroics. It was a demonstration of ordinary life pressed against the machinery of powerful men. The backlash was immediate. Ferraro's lawyers released a statement accusing Lucia of opportunism. A well-placed columnist wrote that Marco's silence about his past was proof enough. Anonymous emails arrived at the school with concerns about safety. For a breathless week, the city surged with gossip. But the inquiry had also been ignited. Regulators opened files, auditors requested corporate papers, and the journalist published a long read that connected shell company payments to a stitched campaign of erosion against targeted women. The public, when offered a map rather than a story that simplified, chose to be outraged in a way that domestic rumor had not predicted. Gianni Ferraro did not react with immediate force. He tried first to redistribute blame, to behave as if corporate governance had failed him rather than as if he'd used it. But when subpoenas arrived with recommended prosecutors, and when bank auditors began to trace patterns that left fingerprints on transactions, his empire felt the first twinges of political liability. Economies of reputation have thresholds. When enough regulators look up from ledgers, infrastructure creaks. The man who had once moved through rooms with a certainty that made others buckle now found his moves catalogued and cross-referenced. The cost to Marco, however, escalated in the subtler theaters. Schoolyard questions, unsolicited welfare checks, a social worker's file that had been opened after a neighbor's wary call. He weathered each test with the curt patience of a man who would not let his anger become a weapon against the children he loved. Lucia bore witness to this restraint and felt a gruesome twin sensation, gratitude and guilt. She had asked him to stand in public with her. She had not expected to see how near his soft domestic life could come to being cleaved by institutions. Then came the first sacrifice. Marco received a quiet offer from a man he had once crossed paths with in older days. The proposal was hideous in its simplicity. Leave the fight in exchange for a guarantee that his children would be left alone. No public records, no courts. Quietly broker a retreat, and the machine would turn elsewhere. Marco brought the offer to Lucia in the kitchen at midnight, the light from the street lamp cutting the room into a bar of gold. "I could take it," he said, not as a question, but as a possibility, aloud into the air. "I could walk away. It would cost me my pride. It would cost me your fight. But the kids." His voice broke on the familiar pledge. Lucia looked at him, and for the first time, the dynamic was not tactical, but tender, in a raw, unvarnished way. She saw the man who made meatballs from memory, and who patched a stuffed rabbit with the kind of deliberation she had once used on legal briefs. She thought of the children whose laughter now threaded her life. "If you take it," she said slowly, "they win twice. They silence me, and they force you back into a silence that will cost your children their father in the long run." She kept her voice steady, though the choice she presented was a savage one. Ask him to risk all, or allow the machine to buy their quiet. He closed his eyes and exhaled a breath that carried years. "I will not bargain my children for a principle," he said finally, and the words were both a refusal and an oath. "But I will not step back in a way that shames us." The compromise he offered was different and more dangerous. He would remain, but he would change the way he worked. He would accept no backroom offers. He would bring his old contacts into the light, naming them, exposing the elder who had brokered impunity from men like Ferraro. He would make his past a ledger on the record rather than a tool in someone's pocket. It was a sacrifice of privacy and perhaps of safety. It was also a claim. To name meant to risk more, but to leave the names unnamed had produced the very pattern Ferraro exploited. Marco chose to confront the code rather than hide from it. He decided to make the scaffold of obligation public and thus visible to accountability. Lucia, moved and terrified, took his offered hand across the kitchen table and squeezed it until the knuckles whitened. The hearings that followed were shaming and clarifying. Marco sat in panels and answered questions about his youth with the honesty of a man who had traded a ledger of sins for receipts of small things. He laid out the names of contacts who brokered silence. He presented as proof letters and old receipts and one faded photograph of an exchange at a port. Lucia stood beside him and spoke with the same exactitude she'd always used in courtrooms. Their testimonies dovetailed. She presented the forensics. He provided the human context that made the paperwork move from abstract to moral. It was not a clean victory. Johnny Ferraro's legal team fought like men whose livelihoods depended on the ability to make reputations elastic. But pruning a machine is slow work. You remove bolts and wires and watch a contraption hiccup. Regulators froze accounts, journalists continued to publish, and pressure mounted from investors who did not like uncertainty. Ferraro himself retreated from public appearances, his tower becoming a private island while the outside world catalogued his maneuvers. The redemption was manifest in small, private places. The council refused the custody petition against Marco on the grounds of insufficient evidence and, more importantly, because public scrutiny had made the idea of seizing his children palpably obscene. The legal filings that had sought to silence Lucia were countered with subpoenaed records that traced a trail too precise to be wished away. In court and in press, the machine that had sought to erase a woman found itself exposed as a mechanism for other people's profit. When the immediate storm passed, the two of them sat on the apartment floor with the children asleep down the hall, a pizza box between them and a patchwork of relief. Marco had lost the option to slip back into anonymity. Lucia had regained the public voice she had been stripped of. Both had paid in ways neither expected, in time away from children, in hearings that dredged up old secrets, in nights where their beds felt like a truce rather than a home. But they had chosen the risk that preserves more than the risk that erases. There was a final, quieter sacrifice that sealed the act. Marco went to the municipal registry and signed a simple form that allowed his children to bear his name in public filings that had previously obscured paternal identity for safety reasons. It was a small bureaucratic act, but a large moral one. An acceptance of visibility that meant his family could not be quietly punished again. He did it because he trusted that the public win would make certain kinds of harm harder to inflict. Lucia, watching him sign, understood that the choice was less about her than about the life they might build together, a life that did not rest on secrecy, on bargains made in the dark. They held each other then, not as saviors, but as two wounded people who had decided to fight together. Their reconciling kiss was not a flourish, but a vow. The world outside still had teeth. Gianni Ferraro still had money and networks. But their claim against him had changed the ledger. They had exposed a machine and kept a small family intact. Sacrifice had been paid, redemption had been made public. And in the quiet that followed the storm, with children dreaming innocently down the hall, they began to speak the dangerous language of future, one that included chosen family, visible loyalty, and an imperfect but shared courage. They sat on the apartment floor with the children asleep as a small domestic peace settled like dust motes in the lamplight. The hearings had left them hollowed and oddly swollen with relief, with legal victories measured not in applause but in the quieting of threats. The machines that had tried to grind them down were still there, but exposed, vulnerable to scrutiny. Lucia folded her hands in her lap and watched Marco, who had traded anonymity for a public ledger of truth, and, in doing so, had made himself something more than a shadow. He looked tired in a way that belonged to people who had done the moral heavy lifting. His shoulders bent, but his eyes kept an alertness that suggested he had not surrendered the habit of protecting. They had rebuilt a life not by erasing their pasts, but by naming them aloud and refusing to let shame determine worth. In the days that followed, the borough where Lucia lived shifted its gaze from curiosity to something quieter, respect. Neighbors who had whispered began to nod across stairwells. The butcher offered extra cuts without ceremony. The doorman, who had slid envelopes under her door months before, smiled in a way that said the town had noticed the scale had been righted. The children returned to their rhythms: homework, scrapes knees, and overused soccer ball. And Marco learned anew the precise arithmetic of small domestic joys. He took to making coffee for Lucia in the mornings, a ritual that felt like a contract rewritten in kindness rather than coercion. Lucia returned to work in a different shape, not the ironclad litigator who had once guarded institutions, but an advocate who now used law to name systems and protect lives. She took pro bono cases for women whose reputations had been weaponized and taught a small class about corporate ethics at the community center where Marco's girls learned to read. Their bond deepened in ordinary things: shared grocery lists, the soft domestic violence of tucking children into bed, the quiet arguments about whether to let a stranger into an installation review. There were still moments where fear braided itself into their speech, times when Marco flinched at a knock, or when Lucia checked the camera feed twice. Those reflexes did not disappear, they softened into care. They learned not to make decisions for one another in secrecy. Transparency replaced unilateral protection. When difficult choices came, requests for interviews, offers of settlements that smelled like silence, they consulted each other, weighing the cost to their home against the glare of public truth. Gianni Ferraro receded into the stories that paper makes of powerful men who miscalculate. He kept his money. He lost the comfortable invisibility that had allowed him to weaponize others. For Lucia and Marco, the new normal was not triumphal so much as honest. A family stitched from choice rather than blood, visible enough to be accountable and private enough to keep its tender corners. On a late spring evening, with windows open to a city that no longer felt like accusation, they stood on the small balcony watching a child kick a ball down the street and felt, together, the strange steady certainty that they had been chosen and had chosen back.